Welcome to our channel. Get ready for a collection of incredible stories that will send shivers down your spine. If you love mystery and horror, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us bring you more thrilling content. Now, turn off the lights, get comfortable, and let's dive into the stories. And that's how they appeared before him. "Welcome back," one of them said. Who exactly, he couldn't tell in the dim light. Philip tried to respond, to ask who they were. But all he managed was a pathetic whisper, barely audible. Still, the visitors replied. "Doesn't matter. We'll explain on the way. Get up." Philip didn't understand at first what they meant. And when he grasped the meaning of the words, he was even more confused. Get up? What do you mean, get up? He couldn't even move his limbs properly, let alone make a sound without triggering a fresh wave of excruciating pain. Come on, come on. We've got other things to do. And you're the last one for today, by the way. So don't keep us waiting, one of them said. And Philip could have sworn they chuckled between themselves. In a hoarse voice, he managed to rasp out, "I can't." "What are you?" A thought began to form in his mind about who these people might be. Maybe they were some kind of physical rehabilitation specialists? And this was their unconventional way of introducing themselves? Some kind of motivational technique, get up, you can do it? But again, why had they come at night? Or was it early morning? More and more questions. And no answers. "We'll help you now," the word sounded oddly alarming. And they moved toward him. "Give me your hand," said the one now standing to the left of the bed. Philip actually tried to do so, but, as expected, couldn't. His arm merely trembled slightly, lifted a little, then dropped back onto the bed, provoking the same pain, though now strangely much weaker. "Relax, I'm joking," snorted the same left-side figure. "Let me." With that, he grabbed Philip's wrist and yanked it forcefully toward himself. This time, there was no pain at all. Philip didn't have time to dwell on it, though, as he noticed something else. All his senses sharpened 100-fold in an instant, then faded just as rapidly, completely. The lingering smell of bleach, likely from the hospital floor's recent cleaning, once faintly noticeable, now vanished. The chill, or even coldness, likely from his fever, no longer crept across his skin, making him shiver. Finally, the same pain surged through his entire body before dissolving entirely, leaving only echoes that tensed his muscles like violent spasms. Most importantly, Philip only now realized he was standing upright. On his feet. And quite steadily at that. The same questions, or rather, new ones, swirled, with the same lack of answers. "You'll have plenty of time to be surprised later. Let's go," commanded the one who had been standing on the right. He gestured for Philip to follow, not a request, an order, and headed toward the ward's exit. Confused, Philip obeyed. What else could he do after being swept into this whirlwind of events? The second guest trailed behind, either completing their trio or cutting off Philip's retreat. Exiting the ward, they turned left, past a few side corridors, and stopped at the elevators. The left elevator opened soundlessly seconds later, admitting them inside. Once the trio entered, it closed just as quietly and began moving. Later, Philip would often wonder if anything at this stage could have hinted at the sinister truths ahead. He'd never recall with certainty, or rather, he'd never untangle whether the events then should have made him question everything or if there'd been logical explanations. For instance, he hadn't seen either escort press any buttons, inside or outside the elevator. The one at the rear might have done it before Philip turned around. As for calling the elevator, maybe the first figure's back had blocked his view. Regardless, the elevator stopped, releasing them into a new corridor. They walked straight, the first figure stopping before a glass door. Opening it, they entered a small, dark room. A lock clanked, and a previously invisible metal door swung outward. Before Philip lay a nighttime street. Under normal circumstances, the cold would have made him huddle, shivering, cursing his companions for dragging him out without a coat, The scene outside was bleak, November in its full glory, the horizon barely tinged with a thin scarlet haze, deepening the oppressive atmosphere. The drizzle and gloom mirrored the inexplicable, sinister situation he found himself in. Yet now, Philip felt no wind, no cold, no discomfort from the rain, the same rain that had likely melted the ice responsible for his accident. His senses felt dulled, if not gone entirely. Was this the aftermath of the crash? A brain injury messing with his nervous system? Even now, he knew something was deeply wrong. Everything happening was not just strange, but terrifyingly ominous. His thoughts were interrupted again. The figure behind shoved him toward the open passenger door of a car that had appeared out of nowhere, a black Volga 3110. Any other time, he'd have admired it, his grandfather had owned the same model, but now he numbly complied. The second figure shut the door the moment Philip was inside. The phrase "burning bridges" flashed in his mind, making him shudder, not from cold, but dread. Lost in thought, he didn't notice them leaving the hospital grounds through a gate with a broken barrier. A question from the front passenger snapped him back. "Unusual situation for you, eh? Who are you?" Enough with the clichés, the driver chimed in, half joking. "Aren't you curious how you're sitting here unaided? Walking those grim corridors on your own? Others in your state would have been writhing in pain, coughing up blood on a gurney. But you, TSK." He shook his head theatrically. "You'd better ask, where are we going? If you're going to ask cliched questions, at least make it a practical one." "That's more pressing," said the driver. "Where are we going?" Philip asked, and for some reason, he was afraid to hear the answer. The terrible suspicion that had first crept into his mind at the hospital now rang louder in his head. The guests exchanged visibly excited glances. The one in the passenger seat rubbed his hands together in anticipation, a mischievous smile playing on his lips. Philip's horror grew at their reaction. Before his eyes, the suspicion was turning into near certainty. "I see you're starting to figure it out," the driver said seriously, without turning around. The second guest straightened up, audibly inhaling through his nose, and rubbed his hands even more vigorously. His entire demeanor screamed impatience to continue the explanation. The fear, almost panic, written on Philip's face clearly amused him. The monotony of his routine work, Philip had no doubt this was ordinary for him, was clearly compensated for by moments like these. But the other guest decided to cut their conversation short. "We're going to the city center." "I think you've been there often," he said. His partner shot him an annoyed glare and visibly deflated. His hopes for continuing the discussion were dashed. He turned to the window and remained silent for the rest of the ride. Philip wasn't exactly surprised by this mundane answer, but it did calm him somewhat. Though deep down, he knew the terrible realization would come soon, if it hadn't already, even without final confirmation. He'd only been granted a temporary reprieve. It felt like he was being given time to prepare and come to terms with something. But prepare for what? Philip had indeed been to the city center many times. He knew almost every street they were passing. Yet their route was extremely strange. They zigzagged through the dark courtyards of two parallel main streets, constantly crossing one or the other, emerging from an alley, crossing a double solid line, and entering another alley opposite. Then they'd wind through more courtyards, cross the street again, and end up in the same courtyards they'd left minutes earlier, just a bit further down. They moved in zigzags, parallel to the streets, first in one direction, then the opposite. After a considerable amount of wandering, they finally reached the city center, where things at first seemed more logical. They drove past the main square, crossed the dark courtyard of an institute, and ventured into an industrial zone, which inconveniently bordered the city's cultural center. Then something completely illogical happened, making their earlier wanderings seem almost reasonable by comparison. They entered the grounds of some factory, its open-air courtyard shrouded in smoke billowing from a massive chimney, now bathed in the dim light of early dawn. The Volga stopped. The guests exchanged glances, or rather, the driver shot a quick look at the passenger, who didn't return it, continuing to sulk and stare out the window. Apparently, the subtle importance of the moment, hinted at by the second guest's demeanor and their stopping, held no interest for him. As Philip later realized, this stop meant nothing to the guests. For them, nothing new was happening. This theater was for his benefit. But why? The engine started again. The Volga reversed at high speed through the same gates it had entered a minute earlier. Despite the absurdity of the moment and the utter confusion he was in, Philip still recognized the danger of such a maneuver. As they sped backward through the narrow factory yard, he ducked, pressing himself against the back of the driver's seat and squeezing his eyes shut. The driver didn't look back once during the maneuver. Expecting a crash, Philip kept his eyes closed. When they came to a safe stop, he exhaled and opened them. Straightening up, he didn't immediately understand why the guests were acting so strangely. Both had turned to him, watching him with eager anticipation, grinning almost maniacally, their eyes gleaming in the dim light of the car, making them look eerily like dogs. Philip didn't know what they wanted from him. Then it hit him, they were waiting for his reaction. Like children who'd discovered a secret passage in a familiar rock, played there to their heart's content, and then brought friends to enjoy their reactions as the discoverers. But what reaction were they expecting? Philip looked around in confusion. His confusion first turned into complete incomprehension. And when understanding finally dawned, albeit slowly, he was struck dumb. They were sitting in the same Volga, which was now back in the same hospital courtyard they'd left about an hour ago, though morning still hadn't arrived, stuck in the twilight of dawn. The courtyard was at least 10 kilometers from the city center, and therefore from the industrial zone. "So, what do you think?" asked the driver. How is this possible?" Philip stammered, his words as tangled as his thoughts. "Oh ho," the guest replied vaguely, whistling. "Let's go. But close your mouth, or it'll fall off from shock." He opened the driver's door and stepped out. With a sharp motion, he opened Philip's door too, though Philip had no desire to get out. Despite their seemingly miraculous return, he had an irrational feeling that they were now much further from the starting point, from the moment they'd left the hospital, than they'd been in the city center or the industrial zone. The sight of the hospital, which they supposedly were about to re-enter, didn't dispel this feeling, it strangely intensified it. It felt like some kind of substitution. A slimy, disgusting, almost blasphemous sensation. It grew stronger with each second as they stood in silence, and he stared at the hospital. A thought of sinking emerged. That he was sinking deeper and deeper, enveloped not by water, but by something like swampy muck. Though not physical. Oddly, the guests didn't rush him, but silently waited for him to gather his thoughts, which didn't align with their earlier behavior. When Philip, snapping out of his thoughts, noticed their change in demeanor and wondered at it, they seemed to wake up again. "Let's go," the guest commanded. "Come on, don't dawdle," the second one said nervously, hurrying to open the doors to the hospital lobby. They both seemed to have woken up and were now visibly scared of the few dozen seconds they'd wasted in inaction, rushing to make up for it. The first guest almost angrily shoved Philip's shoulder and barked, "Move. Wait, stop." Philip dodged away and took a few steps back. To his own surprise, a wave of anger surged over him at everything that was happening. And there was nothing surprising about that. Just this morning, or rather, the last morning he remembered, which was therefore his today, he had been living his most ordinary day. Unremarkable, but comfortable in its predictability. He knew exactly how his evening would go. He'd come back to his rented apartment, utterly exhausted. Not so much from work itself, but from another day spent after a nearly sleepless night. He'd collapse onto the couch without even undressing. Most likely, after sleeping no more than 3 or 4 hours, he'd get up, strip off his work clothes, go to the kitchen, and light a cigarette. He'd sit at the table, turn on the TV, flip through the late-night programs, and call for food delivery. This dull routine irritated him, yet at the same time, strangely, it was comforting in its inevitability. He kept telling himself that he would change everything soon, but kept postponing it. And so, he lived his ordinary life. And now, in less than a day, at least by his own perception, everything had taken a wild turn. And not just any turn, one he couldn't even begin to comprehend. What was he supposed to expect now? After everything he had already witnessed, he wouldn't have been surprised if one of these guests, or maybe both at once, suddenly bared their fangs and lunged at him. It would have fit right into the absurdity of it all. But no. They didn't lunge. Instead, they seemed to deflate all at once, as if they had expected something like this from him but sincerely hoped it wouldn't happen. The one who had gone to open the doors lowered his head, gripping the handle of one of them, and stood still. The other, who had been urging Philip forward just seconds ago, remained composed. He stood half-turned, looking at Philip, then glanced over his shoulder at his partner before finally turning back and saying, "I don't know about him, but personally, I always hope these moments won't happen. And almost every time, I'm wrong." "Why?" Philip pleaded. "Both of you, explain to me what's going on." His bravado was quickly fading, and fear was creeping back in. He realized that angering these two wasn't a good idea. And fortunately for him, which he also understood, they weren't angry, just disappointed. "You're dead." "Yes, Philip. You're dead. And don't even try to play mind games with yourself, don't focus on the wrong thing and ask me how I know your name. The important part is that you're dead. And you're far from unique in that regard. So, let's move. I'll explain everything on the way, everything I know. And trust me, that will be more than enough." Philip stood frozen, as if struck by lightning. He watched, like a fish behind aquarium glass, as the guest cautiously approached to grab his arm. It would have been almost funny, how the man seemed to fear that Philip might bolt at any second. As if he wouldn't catch him in an instant. But that wasn't the point. It was something else. Something along the lines of the very psychology the stranger had just mentioned. It's one thing to suspect the truth. Yes, Philip had already been hovering on the brink of a horrifying realization. But suspecting was one thing. Hearing it confirmed, undeniably, irrevocably, was something else entirely. Even in his dazed state, Philip somehow understood, deep down, he knew, that these people needed him to absorb what he had just heard with as little distress as possible. Though, of course, the very idea that such a shattering, deeply personal revelation could be softened was laughable. No one could ever truly be prepared to hear news like this. "That's why I hate these moments," the guest muttered. "Every time, I hope we'll be done with you before you work up the nerve to ask the big question." Slowly, he reached for Philip's arm and led him toward the hospital. He was visibly tense, but when he saw that Philip wasn't resisting, he relaxed, just a little. Believe me, everyone starts suspecting. Whether they were brilliant thinkers in life or not. The only question is who has the guts to ask. You were delaying it, weren't you? Admit it. You would have been happier if we had kept driving through the night. By the way, that's what those little trips are for. They had reached the hospital entrance. The second guest, evidently relieved that his partner had taken over the role of explaining things, gave Philip a dry smile as he held the door open. The darkness of the hospital lobby greeted them in silence. This wing had clearly been out of use for a long time, the lack of lighting and the absolute emptiness made that obvious. If this were the main entrance, it wouldn't be this deserted. The door creaked shut behind them. The second guest had followed them inside. By now, Philip no longer questioned the lack of cold. It would have been strange to expect it here, inside, when he hadn't even felt it outside. As I was saying about the car rides, the guest leading Philip by the arm gestured for his partner to go ahead. They clear the mind. I won't say brain, that's not your case anymore. Anyway, they give you time to collect your thoughts. Of course, not for everyone. Some, like you, only overthink things even more, piling on extra questions. That's why I told you not to ask how I know your name. It's a way of distracting yourself, isn't it? Trying to latch onto something secondary so you don't have to ask the real question. I'm telling you, everyone suspects. Almost immediately, they figure out what's happening. Or at least, they have a strong hunch. But they push the thought away. That's why the car rides help. To process it. To accept it. Some people manage to answer the question for themselves. And once they do, they don't trouble us with it. But not everyone. Not by a long shot. I'll be honest, we cut corners. Every time, we hope you'll never actually ask. That you won't have the nerve. That you'll put it off long enough for us to leave you behind. And by then, others will take over. By then, the question won't even need to be asked anymore. Everything will already be clear. Dear friends, thank you for joining us on this journey. If you enjoyed this dive into the realm of the unknown, please hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and tap the notification bell so you won't miss the next video. More mysteries, more magic, and unexpected discoveries await. Together, we'll unravel every last enigma.